Awesome. All right, well, let's go ahead and go back to our presentation and let's begin today's webinar. Let it load here shortly. All right. So again, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Investigation, Prosecution, and Treatment of Juvenile Sex Offenders. My name is William Moore, and I'm with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. And before we get started with today's webinar, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to discuss a few features of the Adobe Connect webinar platform and provide a few announcements to keep in mind. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded. Please note that we will have availability or access to the webinar. You can contact us at the OJJDP TTA Help Desk for any questions in regards to the webinar recording for today. For those looking or wishing to download a copy of important documents and resources related to today's webinar, you may do so by locating the handouts pod that's located directly below the PowerPoint and right next to the closed caption that you see here. You can simply click on the name of the file and then click the download button, and it will download directly to the device where you're joining the webinar today. At the end of today's webinar, Victor will address questions that were both submitted before today's presentation and during the presentation. If you would like to submit your question during today's presentation, feel free to type your question into the chat box as it arrives, and we will put your question in queue for Victor to address at the end of today's presentation. Note that individuals will receive a certificate of attendance via an Adobe Connect thank you email. Please look out in your inbox for an email from Adobe that will say thank you for attending, but then also will provide a certificate. However, if you are joined in a group, and we'll go over the group in a minute, we do ask for you all to please let us know how many additional people are in the room with you through the group validation form, and those additional people will indeed be able to provide their names and receive a certificate as well. So speaking of that, if you all could, individuals who are joined in the group, let's get a good count of how many additional people we have with us. Go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. Don't include yourself. Include one additional person. So, for example, if it's me and my dad who are watching today's presentation, I will count one because my father is the one additional person. So please type in the additional person in the room with you today. If there's no one in the room, there's no need to type anything at this time. That being said, I would like to turn today's webinar over to our presenter, Victor Vieth. Victor, take it away.
Great. Thank you, William. It's good to be with you, and my thanks to everybody who's joining us for the webinar this afternoon. I am Victor Vieth. My title is Director of Education and Research for the Zero Abuse Project. I have been in the field of child protection for 33 years as a frontline prosecutor in Minnesota for a decade. Then I went to our nation's capital and worked with the National District Attorneys Association for 10 years, 8 of those 10 years directing their National Center for Prosecution of Child Abuse. I then went home to Minnesota, and under a federal award to my alma mater, we developed a project called Child Advocacy Studies designed to dramatically improve undergraduate and graduate training of future child protection professionals. That initiative spread to currently 28 states and 85 universities and counting. And then our Zero Abuse Project was awarded a 3-year grant from the Department of Justice in the last year, and so we are growing dramatically the number of trainings we do for frontline child abuse investigators and prosecutors. Almost everything we do is absolutely free, so reach out to us for assistance on your individual cases, befriend us on social media, fill out the form on our website so you're always alerted as to our webinars or publications or other resources for frontline professionals such as each of you. The subject at hand today is how do we investigate and how, if we need to, do we prosecute in juvenile or even adult court a child who has committed an act of a sexual assault, such that if committed by an adult would warrant a criminal reaction. To that end, toward that goal, we'll chat a little bit about the history of responding to juvenile sex offender cases. History is important because if we don't know where we've been, it's hard to figure out where we're going. I'm going to make an argument throughout the presentation that oftentimes as I travel across the country, my sense is that our current practice in responding to this population is often lagging behind the research. I'll illustrate that through a hypothetical case I'll call checking the box. It's a composite of a number of cases that have crossed my desk over the years. I think it's representative of what I see in the country, and we'll return to that scenario throughout this presentation. What exactly is the current state of our knowledge? We'll chat about that in some depth. We'll look at some data suggesting that most juvenile offenders are boys, and if that is true, it begs the question, what, if anything, is unique about boys and how they may experience trauma that may result in more of them as opposed to girls engaging in sexual offenses. And then we'll apply this knowledge practically in terms of our multidisciplinary response to these cases. We'll look at what is normal, abnormal sexual behavior before and after adolescence. How do we go about actually investigating these cases? How do you interrogate a child who may have committed a sexual offense? What do you do as a forensic interviewer if you're interviewing a child who may be both a victim and an offender? How do you handle that? What does the research say about best practices in terms of treatment? When, if ever, do we reunite two siblings where one has sexually assaulted another? And if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about the issue of the registration of juveniles as offenders. I was part of this project through the SMART office in the Department of Justice. It originally began, they convened more than 50 national experts, and we just spent a few days chatting about what does the research say about both juvenile and adult sex offenders, and what does that research tell us about what is or is not best practice. SMAPI is an extraordinary resource. The Department of Justice updates it regularly, and so check it out. A lot of what I chat about today will be drawn from the SMAPI report. Historically, the population of children who engaged in sexual offenses with other children wasn't seen as all that big a deal. There was an attitude of boys will be boys and they'll outgrow it eventually. However, beginning in the 1970s, continuing until the 1980s, there was a number of studies on adult sex offenders that discovered they began to act out in sexually inappropriate way as juveniles. And so there was this thought, gosh, they are in essence many pedophiles, and so we need to nip this in the bud when they are still children. Well, as a result of that, there was early on a heavy emphasis on treating juveniles as we might treat adult sex offenders. And so the treatment modalities, the criminal justice response was really focused in that narrow niche. Then, however, we began to grow our knowledge of this population. Juvenile treatment programs exploded 40-fold between 82 and 92. I can't find a current number, but I'm sure there's a great many more now. And then the research began to explode as we worked with this population. Finkelhor in 2009 said as of that year there were well more than 200 peer-reviewed studies specifically on this population, and there are a number of additional studies in the decade plus. And yet, despite this large body of knowledge, oftentimes frontline professionals, our actual practice, our actual work is lagging behind the research. And I'll illustrate that with this hypothetical case. Here we will call our offender John. John is 12 years old and he is adopted. He has an adverse childhood experience score of 7, so significant trauma in his childhood. He's been diagnosed with ADHD as well as an anxiety disorder. He lags in social competency. He just can't make friends very well in school. His adopted parents discover that on 4 separate occasions, John had sexual intercourse with Sally, who is also 12 years old. She is his sister. She is also adopted, even though the two are not biologically related. However, she cannot consent. She is developmentally delayed. And as a result, John was adjudicated delinquent and ordered to abide by a treatment plan. As it turns out, though, because of his high ACE score, his ADHD, his anxiety disorder diagnoses, John already has multiple treatment providers who are working with him on these issues. However, he is now assigned a sex offender treatment provider, and John is working with that provider, making great progress, is actually in the final stages of that treatment program, when unfortunately his provider gets her dream job and up and leaves to another state. So we have to find John a new treatment provider, but the probation officer, the social worker, the prosecutor's office, everybody struggles to find that. John's family, though, hits the book and is searching as well. And eventually his mother, who is a social worker, discovers a man who says he is a treatment provider, although he has largely worked with adults. He nonetheless has an MA in counseling. And he says that he can do it. However, he says that he needs to start completely over. He's not interested in what the prior offender provider was working with John on. He doesn't want to see any of those notes. He argues that may bias him in some way. He also says it's completely irrelevant what they may be working on in terms of his anxiety disorder or his ADHD or the problems he's having at school or the conflicts he's having with his adoptive mother. All of that, he says, is irrelevant to the issue of John acting out in sexually inappropriate ways. So he starts all over. And it does seem that he's making good progress, and eventually all of the treatment providers say it's about time for John to be able to come back home. It's about as good as it is going to get. However, the new treatment provider is not on board, and as we begin to search through what he's doing, he's using models that are largely utilized for adults, and he's not truly following best practices in the field. So eventually there's a big meeting with the prosecutor and the public defender and the treatment providers, and somebody explains to everybody, gosh, under the research, it's about as good as it gets, and it's about time that he comes back home. But ironically, John's public defender is the one who objects and says, wait a minute, we're about to go into court, and for the judge, it's all about checking the box. And so unless and until the one person who represents that he is a sex offender treatment provider says that John can go back home, it's just not going to happen. We cannot yet check that box. So we'll keep coming back to that scenario as we work through the literature. What exactly is a juvenile sex offense? Well, most children, depending on how you measure sexual activity, will do something of a sexual nature in or before adolescence. Criminal courts, juvenile delinquency courts, child protection courts, we don't typically get involved with any of that unless there's a significant age difference or there's force or there's some conduct which, if committed by an adult, would warrant criminal action. How prevalent are juvenile sex offenses? Well, about a quarter of all sex offenders in the United States are themselves children, and about a third of all child molestations are committed by other children. Well, who does it? Who exactly commits these juvenile sex offenses? Well, according to this OJJDP publication, 5% are younger than 9, 16% are younger than 12, and then we see this spike from the ages of 12 to 14. And of course, you know why that is. They're going through puberty. Their hormones are raging. So if I want to prevent juvenile sexual offenses in my community, I would target my prevention initiatives for adolescent children, perhaps adolescent boys. We'll talk more about that in a minute. 46% are between the ages of 15 and 17. If we look at those children who get caught engaging in sexual misconduct, then 93% are boys, 7% are girls. Again, that may not be the actual numbers, but based on those who get caught, most of the time the offender is a boy. If that's what we know about the offenders, what, if anything, do we know about the victims of juvenile sexual offenders? Well, 60% or so are younger than 12, and that would be a higher percentage than we would see from adult offenders. And then you see this pattern as it appears on the screen. Generally speaking, the offender is a couple years younger than is the victim. 78 or so percent of victims are girls, 24% are boys. That exceeds 100% because some offenders violate against both genders. Well, if it's true that 90% plus of offenders are, in fact, boys, is there anything unique about boys, anything unique about how they experience trauma that may help us explain that particular finding? There is some research that may shed some light on this. This study was of men who were sexually abused as children. And they discovered these men delayed their disclosure for decades, not delayed until they called the police, but delayed for decades sharing with anybody their history of sexual abuse. So the researchers said to these men, what kept you quiet for so long? And the number one reason was, I just don't want to be labeled weak. In our society, boys are supposed to be tough. They're supposed to be strong. I'm familiar with a case where a priest was charged with sexually abusing a number of boys. They were all men when the victims came forward. And they all said to the detective they were 14, 15, 16 when they were sexually abused by this priest at a certain shopping mall. Well, the prosecutor in that case gets the case, and she grew up in that particular community, and she knew the shopping mall did not exist when these victims were 15 or 16 or 17. They had to be 5 or 6 or 7 years of age. And so she shares that with the detective, and he says, you're right, I can't believe that I missed that. And so he goes back and re-interviews these victims, and many of them do take it back and say, you're right, I lied. I was much younger when I was abused in that mall, but I had to lie to you because I was the captain of the 9th grade football team. I was big and strong, and I could have cried out. I should have been able to do something, but I just froze when I was being sexually violated in that mall. Some of the men didn't back down, though, and they said, I don't care what you're saying about when that mall existed or when it didn't. I know I was 5 or 6 or 7. And that prosecutor, who is a friend of mine to this day, believes that some of those men actually convinced themselves they were much younger than they really were. This feeling of, I don't want to admit any sort of weakness. And this is why sometimes when you interview boys who are victimized, they will make empowering statements during the forensic interview. I had a case when I was a prosecutor of child torture, and when the boy was interviewed, we said, hey, well, what happened next? And he said, well, then I kicked in the groin, this big guy, and I threw him out the window, and he bounced like a bumble, and then I fell asleep, and that's when he got me tied up and did these horrible acts. Well, of course that little boy didn't do that. It was just an empowering statement. He's conveying to us and the other team members, I just don't want to be labeled weak. So that's a factor. Another factor is a lot of these men said, I don't want to be labeled gay, which could take on a whole array of issues. Maybe the victim is not gay and they just don't want the label. Maybe they are gay and they haven't shared that with their parents or others. If you've ever seen the movie Spotlight, there is a scene where the Boston Globe reporter, Sasha Pfeiffer, is interviewing this man who was sexually abused as a boy by a priest. And the man says, look, I was 14. I knew I was gay, but I hadn't told my parents. I knew they'd be very angry. I knew the church at that time would condemn me. So I just didn't know what to do. And then there was this hip priest with long hair, and he played pool with me and the boys, and we loved this guy. We thought he was the salt of the earth. And then one day he talks to me about my sexual orientation, and he says it's not wrong, it's not sinful as long as it's loving, and he is touching my knee, and then he's coming closer to my groin, then my body betrays me, and the next thing I know I'm being sexually abused. And now I'm triply confused. I already didn't know how to talk about my orientation with others, and now my first sexual experience is at the hands of a godly figure who my parents adore. I think I better keep my mouth shut. I was training at a conference once, and a man came up to me at the break and told me he was gay and in a committed relationship, married to a husband. And he said, you know, to this day, I just don't share with very many people that when I was in high school, I was sexually abused by a man. And the reason for that is, until my dying day, there'd be some members of our community who would say, oh, he's gay because he was sexually abused. No, I'm gay and I was sexually abused. The two are not related. So all those factors and more may keep some boys quiet. And many of the men in this study said, hey, it wasn't on mom and dad's radar screen that I could be abused as a child. Yeah, they'd talk about personal safety with my sisters, but never with me. And so I just didn't think when it happened that I could come and share this experience with them. And as a result of these and other dynamics, the boys in the study delayed disclosure for 20 years. Again, not 20 years until they called the police, 20 years until they told another living human being. And so the researchers concluded that victimization and the way it is experienced for boys, it's not better or worse than it is for girls, but it is different. There are different dynamics taking place. This study says that when a juvenile targets a boy as opposed to a girl, they tend to target much younger children, whereas when they target girls, they target somebody just a year or two younger than they are, but are more physically mature. Now, that could be because younger boys are easier to dominate. It could also be that older boys are being abused, but because of these dynamics, they're just not sharing that experience. I tend to think the latter is more likely to be true. What do we know about the relationship of a juvenile offender with his or her victims? Well, about a quarter of the time they are in the same family unit. 63% of the time they at least know one another through school or a youth serving activity. It's pretty rare that they target a stranger. Sometimes in looking at case files, we're just not sure about the relationship. Where do these sexual acts actually occur? Well, most of the time it's in somebody's home. So if I'm looking to prevent juvenile sexual offenses in my community, I would target adolescent children, especially boys, and I'd be educating moms and dads when you're having sleepovers or birthday parties or other activities at your home. Statistically speaking, that is the most likely setting where one child will sexually assault another. So here are some prevention tips, moms and dads, that can be as simple as regularly checking on the children. Sometimes it happens at school, sometimes in a store or another building, sometimes outside, sometimes we're just not sure. Well, here's the $64,000 question. Why would they do it? Why would a juvenile engage in sexual behavior that represents misconduct? Well, the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers says it's pretty darn complicated. A lot of factors may come into play. What's going on in the child's home? What's going on at their school? What's going on with their friends? What's going on in their neighborhood? A whole host of potentially relevant factors may come into play. And this is why in our hypothetical it was so long for the second treatment provider to say, oh, it's irrelevant that he has conflicts with his adoptive mom. It's irrelevant that he can't make friends at school. It's irrelevant that he's got a high A score. It's irrelevant that he struggles with anxiety. All of those factors may be coming into play, and we have to take every one of them into account. David Finkelhor looks at it another way. He says, well, some juveniles are primarily motivated by curiosity. Others have long-standing patterns of violating the rights of others. Some offenses occur in conjunction with serious mental health problems. Some offending behavior is compulsive, but typically it's impulsive and reflects poor judgment. The Samapi report has an entire chapter on why juveniles may offend, the causes of juvenile offending. Just etiology is a fancy word for causes. But this is the one that we often gravitate to. We say, oh, we got a 16-year-old boy who's sexually abused his 6-year-old sister. No doubt he himself has been sexually abused. Maybe. Sometimes that is what's going on. But according to this study, it's not just any old sexual abuse. It's sexual abuse that begins at a young age. It goes on for a long period of time, and there's no meaningful intervention. So now let's connect the dots between these studies. Remember a few slides ago, what did we know about juveniles? Well, we know they're less likely than girls to tell. They will often delay sharing the experience with anybody for up to 20 years. So they're much less likely to be discovered, and as a result, much less likely to get into treatment or having other meaningful interventions. So that might be one explanation. We see more boy than girl offenders. Another factor, and according to this study, a greater factor, is not that the boy was sexually abused, but that they were beaten. They had a history of physical abuse or neglect. That seems to be a stronger correlation to becoming a juvenile sex offender than does being sexually abused. Now, why on earth might that be? Well, we know that boys get beaten a lot. The ACE research says about 1 out of 4 children are hit to the point of injury, and boys are beaten more often than girls. Fifi in 2013 in a study published in Child Abuse and Neglect said really harsh discipline. So you're not beating the kid to the point where you send them to the hospital, but you're just mean, you're just cruel, you're just harsh. So you're standing in line at McDonald's with your toddler and he's not moving quick enough for your fancy, so you just push him down. Or you're at the playground with your kindergartner and he gets under your skin, so you drag him out of the fray and whack him on the butt a few times and you push him back into the crowd. Nobody watching, much less the child who just got hit, has any idea why you're administering blows. That's the sort of thing they were talking about in this study. And they found that kids growing up in these very arbitrary homes where the discipline is pretty harsh, they're at an elevated risk for a number of medical and mental health conditions as they get older, all very consistent with ACE research. How about this study published in 2014? These neurosurgeons looked at what's going on in the brain of kids who are getting hit quite a bit. So they looked at kids who were getting corporal punishment on a regular basis over a period of 3 years. And they found that kids who fit into that category, there was a noticeable loss of gray matter. Now, I'm a lawyer, not a physician, so I can't explain it to you in the way that the doctor can. But as I understand the study, gray matter is a part of your brain that has a correlation to your IQ and your ability to control your behaviors. So if this study is accurate, kids are getting hit a lot, and certainly kids are being beaten, we may be reducing the very part of their brain that they need to control their behaviors. Now they get into adolescence and their hormones are raging, they've got sexual thoughts galore, and they know kind of they shouldn't touch their younger brother or sister, but that part of the brain has been reduced, and so maybe they have a harder time controlling their behavior. Not sure, but it is something to think about. The study said that juvenile sex offenders, both boys and girls, typically came from very dysfunctional homes where there were high rates of multiple forms of abuse. They were being beaten. They were being starved. They were being sexually touched. They were being emotionally abused. They were witnessing domestic violence. That is what we call polyvictimization. And we know from polyvictimization research, a child who fits into multiple categories is at higher risk to engage in behavioral misconduct, including acting out sexually. David Finkelhor, in a couple of studies, he and his colleagues at the University of New Hampshire looked at about 11,000 cases of substantiated child maltreatment. And what they discovered is when a child is abused in one way, they're often abused in multiple ways. Specifically, 2/3 of maltreated children fit into at least 2 categories of victimization, and about 1/3 fit into 5 or more categories. He also discovered, in terms of their misconduct, juvenile delinquency or acting up at school or being defiant of people in authority or suffering from depression or other mental illnesses, that was more strongly correlated to the number of forms of abuse you endured as opposed to the number of actual incidents of abuse. So what does that mean? Let's say you've got 2 abused kids, Billy and Molly. They both have been maltreated 3 times, but there's a difference. Molly has been sexually abused once, physically abused once, emotionally abused once. Billy has been beaten 3 times. Because Molly fits into 3 different categories, she is more likely to become a bully. She is more likely to be a juvenile delinquent. She is more likely to be promiscuous. She is more likely to engage in concerning sexual behaviors. So, the teaching point is when we work with a child who engages in sexually concerning behavior, we have to think of the possibility of trauma and the possibility of trauma in multiple categories. This study of adult sex offenders further underscores that fact. In this study of men who were in prison convicted as sex offenders, more than half of the men had an ACE score of 4 or higher, so significant levels of trauma in their childhoods. We also know that juveniles who act out sexually often come from homes not only where there's a high ACE score, but there's nobody building a sense of resiliency. Nobody in their life who's saying, you're a great kid, you're special, I love you, I care about you. It's amazing how you can curl that soccer ball with your toe. It's amazing how you can play that cornet. What a terrific musician you are becoming. There's nobody building resiliency, nobody counteracting the negative messages they're getting from the trauma in their homes, and then that increases the risk for poorer outcomes, including misconduct sexually. The study looked at juveniles who sexually violated children younger than themselves, and also looked at offenders who violated peers or older children or even adults. And they found that there were some noticeable differences. Those children who were sexually assaulting younger kids very rarely used aggression. They were more likely to be touching sexually somebody in their home or somebody they were related to. They often had deficits in psychosocial functioning and more likely to meet the criteria for depression or anxiety. Again, let's go back to our case study. John suffers from depression and anxiety. He is abusing his sister, and although she's the same age chronologically, she is developmentally delayed. So he is violating somebody who's younger than him emotionally. So he is fitting into a category that, generally speaking, would be easier to treat. Now, those children who target older children or even adults, they fit into a different category. They are more likely to use force. Makes sense, right? They are going to have to use force to get the older person to submit. They're more likely to use a weapon, less likely to be related to their victim, more likely to commit it in some place other than someone's home. And they just don't have much anxiety or depression or worries about their misconduct. I'm familiar with a case where 3 juveniles broke into an adult woman's home. They tied her up, they cut up beer cans and other objects and tortured her during the night. She almost died because of the assault. She lost so much blood. Obviously, children who fit into that category are going to be much harder to treat, much harder to address before they age out of the delinquency court. Those are the sort of kids that are more likely to be referenced to adult court. But this is just a generalization. You're going to have to get to know each particular offender. There is a group of adolescents who offend against younger kids, but they fit into this more concerning category of more difficult to treat. And you may have a juvenile who violates someone older than themselves, but they fit into a category where they will be easier to treat. We often forget this, but children succumb to peer pressure at a level that we adults do not. And this is borne out by the research. About a quarter of all juvenile sex offenses involve multiple offenders. That's much higher than we would see from adult offenders, and it certainly suggests the possibility of peer pressure playing a role. I'm a huge Johnny Cash fan. I've got 100 plus CDs and albums and a whole lot of Johnny Cash paraphernalia. And I read a lot of books about the Man in Black. And this is the favorite biography I've ever read. It uncovered a lot in his childhood that helped explain some of his own misconduct. And it has an anecdote where, as a juvenile, he was egged into sexually touching a developmentally delayed girl. And according to this biography, he didn't want to do it. He had immediate and long-term remorse. Well, if he could go back in time, every one of those boys should be charged in delinquency court. But Johnny Cash wouldn't fit into quite the same category as those children who developed the idea and were the very egregious aggressors. He would fit into a different category. And I'll give you a few case examples to highlight that as well. But we have to take into account that dynamic when we work with this population also. So what is normal or abnormal sexual behavior? If most kids do something sexual before adolescence and most do something when they're adolescents or teens, then how do we sort through as multidisciplinary team members when it is that we in the government should get involved? Remember, again, depending on how you measure sexual activity, most kids will do something sexual even at a very young age. But for little kids, it's not really sexual. That's not why they're touching or looking at genitals. They're just curious. They're trying to explore the world. What are these things all about as they play house or doctor? And they're not driving toward the goal of an orgasm or sexual pleasure. They're just trying to figure out how these things work and what exactly you do with them. So generally speaking, as long as the sexual conduct is between children of about the same age and there's no force employed, then probably it just is something that needs some education and doesn't warrant a report to the authorities. Dr. Tony Kavanaugh Johnson says that we can't look at sexual activity among young children with our grown-up eyes. We think it's for sexual enjoyment or procreation or orgasm, but that's not how these kids are looking at it. For them, it's just a great secrecy. It's a mystery, and I so want to know what this is all about. So it's a very different scenario. So what exactly then is normal? The American Academy of Pediatrics says all of this for children 2 to 6 years of age is perfectly normal. They will touch their genitals. They will show off their genitals. They like to look at the genitals of others if they get a chance. And they love to talk about peeing and pooping and farting because it's just so much fun to chat about that. There was a case in South Carolina I consulted on where a 3-year-old girl said in her daycare one morning, "Daddy put his pee on my pee." And the daycare provider thought, oh, she's making disclosure of sexual abuse. Well, during the forensic interview, this is what was discovered. All that happened is that a morning she went into the bathroom and urinated, and then her father came in right after and says, honey, don't flush the toilet, I got to pee too. And then the girl leaves the bathroom, and Dad does everything right. He closes the door, he locks the door, but because she's 3, this is hilarious, right? Daddy's going to pee on my pee. So she puts her little ear up to the door and can hear Dad tinkle, 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 and she can't wait to get to the daycare and tell everybody how Daddy put his pee on my pee, not realizing that might trigger a mandated report and a multidisciplinary team investigation. It was normal behavior, and because in her age range they love to talk about this stuff, that's all that was going on. Very consistent with the AAP, the National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network says for kids below the age of 4, they will certainly explore private parts publicly or in private. They like to rub their hand or even objects against private parts. They will show off their private parts to others. I remember when my wife and I were newlyweds. We were visiting one of her siblings who had a very large family, and all her kids were little at that time. And it was Saturday night, and everybody was to get a bath. And the 5-year-old already had her bath, and I'm sitting on the couch trying to be a good uncle and reading her a storybook. And the 2-year-old escapes Mom's clutches and runs through the house naked. And the 5-year-old turns to me and says, Uncle Victor, he does that all the time, and it is so annoying. And I said, well, I'm sure it is annoying, honey, but the good news is that no less an authority than the American Academy of Pediatrics and the National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network says that's what 2-year-olds do, and he's going to outgrow that. And sure enough, he eventually did. So they like to run around naked, like to take off their clothes. They'll be very curious if they could see Mom or Dad or others undressing. And again, they love to talk about peeing and pooping and farting because that's what they associate with their private parts. As an aside, for those of you who are forensic interviewers, this is why it is so often silly when defense experts come to court and say, oh, you showed the child an anatomical diagram. They're right away going to think of fellatio and cunnilingus and anal intercourse and other sexual acts. No. If they haven't had a sexual experience or haven't been exposed to explicit pornography, they're going to be thinking of peeing and pooping and farting when they see those diagrams. For 4 to 6-year-old children, the National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network says now we're getting a little closer to what we might describe as masturbation. They don't fully understand it, but they know it feels good. And they're interested in seeing others naked. They may mimic dating behavior in their play, kissing, holding hands, because maybe they've seen mom and dad do that or seen it on TV. They might use naughty words, but they usually have no idea what they're talking about. It's just something they picked up on TV or heard someone say. My son Christian, when he was in this age range, my wife signs him up for T-ball, and then I get a letter from the coach. Hey, we got this great deal at the local Target. You go there, you use this code, you can get a great deal on a bat, a ball, a glove, and a protective cup. So I take my son after school to Target. We buy all this stuff, and I'm driving home. And in the rearview mirror, I see him take everything out of the shopping bag. And he now takes the cup out, and he's removing it from the box. And I quickly say a prayer. I say, Dear Lord, please let me get home before he asks a question about that cup, because you know my wife can answer that stuff better than I can. Sometimes, though, God doesn't answer your prayers exactly as you want, and so I hit a red light, and out of the back seat, I hear my little boy say, hey, Dad, I'm so glad we got the cup. You got to protect the family jewels. What? Trust me, this is not a phrase I've ever used in my life. But thankfully, I knew something about child development, so I took a deep breath, and I said, son, what does that mean, protect the family jewels? And I forget his response, but it was so obvious he had no idea what he was talking about. My guess is he was maybe bragging at school. He's going to go to Target and get all this stuff for T-ball. Maybe an older boy teased him and said, oh, yeah, I got to get the cup, got to protect those family jewels. And he just picked up on that somehow it was funny and wanted to spring it on me. But they usually just don't know what they're talking about. They might explore private parts during a play, show me yours, I'll show you mine, but again, it is usually simply a product of curiosity. So let's take a look at some scenarios, see how you apply the research. So we got 3 girls, they're all 5 years old, and somebody walks in and notices they're all playing in a room, and their pants and panties off, and they're pointing to each other's genitals, and they're giggling. Is that normal or abnormal? According to the research, it's normal, and Dr. Tony Kavanaugh-Johnson says all you need to do is to say, hey, it looks like you're touching each other's privates. That's not a good idea. You can certainly touch your own, but you're not allowed to touch other people's parts, and they're not supposed to touch you either. And now with that instruction, it's probably not going to happen again. If it continues to do, if they continue to engage in that behavior, maybe it's a different situation. The National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network says for 7 to 12-year-old children, all of this is perfectly normal. As they get to adolescence, they're certainly now masturbating. They're getting a sense now they need to do it in private. They may play games with kids their own age, truth or dare, boyfriend, girlfriend. They're interested in erotica, and if they have a cell phone, they're probably accessing pornography, even really hardcore pornography. They're looking at it. They're curious, and they want more privacy now. They're not dressing in front of others. They're not running through the house naked. They get a sense that that's not something that is socially acceptable. And they're starting to be sexually attracted to their peers. So what would you say if you discover 2 pre-teenagers exploring each other's bodies? Well, Dr. Johnson says something along these lines. Well, a lot of responsibility goes with sexual looking and touching. Do you know how babies are made? These are things to talk over with your moms and dad. Do you have any question for me today? So again, if it's about the same age and it's consensual and there's not force, it is usually simply a matter of education. What then is abnormal behavior for children before adolescence? Dr. Bill Friedrich is no longer with us, lost his battle to cancer a number of years ago, but he was a great mental health provider and researcher from the Mayo Clinic. He spent years researching the sexual behaviors of children. His dream was to get to a diagnostic tool where he could say, if I have a child below a certain age and they engage in a certain sexual behavior, it's diagnostic that they themselves have been a victim of sexual abuse. He never, ever got close to anything like that. But he did develop something he called the Child Sexual Behavior Inventory. And he said based on his research and his clinical experience, these were the behaviors he most often saw in children that he later learned were in fact sexually abused, and these were the behaviors he least often saw in children he concluded had not been sexually abused. So it's not a diagnostic instrument. You can't say if you see these behaviors for sure a child has been sexually abused or endured other trauma, but you can say it's a correlative instrument, and it is raising a red flag, and it is something we need to think about. And the more the behaviors you see, and the younger the child, the more concerning the behavior may be. So what are these things that he found to be abnormal? Well, a little kid putting their mouth on the sex part of another child. My wife, when she was a teacher in Virginia, she had a colleague who walked into the girls' bathroom and discovered a 7-year-old girl performing cunnilingus on a 5-year-old girl. And the 5-year-old girl was pinned against a wall with tears running down her cheeks. Those factors would suggest that this is abnormal. I got a 2-year age difference. It's a very explicit sexual act. It doesn't look like show me yours, I'll show you mine. It looks like cunnilingus, and it looks like it is not fun. We've got a girl who's crying, who's very upset, and yet the older girl is persisting in the conduct. That raises a red flag. I wonder what is driving that behavior. A little child asking others to engage in explicit sexual acts. So not show me yours, I'll show you mine, but very explicit sexual acts. I had a case when I was a young prosecutor almost 30 years ago where a teacher observed a 5-year-old boy go up to other children on the playground. And I'm sorry for the bad language I'm about to use, but it's relevant to the case studied. So the 5-year-old go up to other kids and he said, quote, "Will you suck my dick?" And when other children said no, he'd make a fist and punch him in the stomach. Well, gosh, he's not saying, show me yours, I'll show you mine. He's asking for a very explicit sexual act, and he's very aggressive, very violent when others say no. There's a lot of red flags there. So our MDT did decide to assess it. The little boy denied he was touched sexually, but he did admit that his father was exposing him to explicit sexual imagery. That was enough for us to continue the assessment. We go to the boy's house. His mom is deceased, had died a couple years before. But the single father was very nice and allowed our social worker and our detective to walk through the house freely. I'm not kidding you. They couldn't take 2 steps without stepping on very explicit pornography. The milk glass the boy drank from every morning had a picture of a nude woman performing a sexual act on herself. The investigators walked inside the father's bedroom. He literally had taken a picture of himself naked with an erect penis, and he had the picture framed, and it was hanging on a bedroom wall. We never, ever could prove sexual abuse, but we could prove the child was exposed to sexual imageries well beyond the child's developmental level. We could prove it was showing up in the child's behaviors at school, and this was injurious to the child's future. And so we could prove a civil child protection action. We always thought as we poured services into the family that other secrets would come out. It never happened that way. Maybe the boy hadn't been sexually abused, or maybe we nipped it in the bud before it gravitated to that point. I don't know. If Friedrich were alive, he was a friend of mine, I think he would say, well, you know, even if this is all that happened, that's still consistent with my research, because my research didn't say for sure the child was sexually abused. I just said in my research it's unusual, it's worthy of an assessment. A little child masturbating, certainly as they approach adolescence, that's not unusual, but Friedrich said it's a little more unusual if they're using an object and inserting it in their body cavity at a level where it's painful. So I'm familiar with a case where the girl's 3.5, and when the daycare provider is not looking, she takes a fork from the lunch her mother packed and she shoves it forcibly into her vaginal opening, causing some pain and even drawing some blood. Well, a daycare provider tries to stop it. The girl tries to keep it in. That's abnormal. That's unusual. It was reported to the authorities. And a trauma-informed screener said, yeah, that is unusual enough to warrant a question or two. In that case, mom and dad were divorced, and the assigned investigator decides to talk to both mom and dad and learns a few things. Learns that mom said one of the conflicts they had, his dad insisted that he was the only one that would ever give the girl a bath, and he would bathe her for a long time with the door locked, and mom was never allowed to come in. And so bath time is a subject of conversation between the detective and the father admits that that is true and says that he still, when he gets his daughter for a weekend visit, loves to have some special bath time, and admits that they both get naked and they're in the tub with suds and they wash each other's genitals. That's unusual. That's a little concerning revelation from the father. So the detective goes back to the school and talks to the daycare provider and says, is there anything else concerning? And she says, yeah, she's often demonstrating sexual activity during free playtime in her usage of dolls. And some of these sexual positionings she's showing are a little unusual. So the detective goes back to mom and says, sorry to ask personal questions, but it might be important. Tell me what you can about intimacy with your ex-husband and what were his preferences. And she describes sexual acts and positions that are exactly what this child is demonstrating in her play. Now, the detective goes back to the father, and he shifts from an interview to an interrogation. And a long story short, the father eventually admits that he engaged in genital touching with this child for his own sexual gratification. It begins by understanding that what happened at the daycare was unusual and was worthy of an assessment. Little kids imitating intercourse, they did not acquire that knowledge on Blue's Clues or Sesame Street or Mr. Rogers. So where did that come from if a 4 or 5-year-old is demonstrating that in play or making sexual sounds or French kissing or trying to undress others? Not sure if that would still apply based on more recent research. Asking to watch pornographic imagery imitating sexual behavior with dolls. What's he talking about here? My daughter Naomi is all grown up. She's married. She's a school teacher in Michigan. She's actually visiting, and she has a little boy named James who is 8 weeks old. And so when we're done here today, I get to visit with my grandson. Looking forward to that. So my daughter, all grown up, is not playing with dolls anymore. But when she was a little girl, she did. And when she was about 5, she had 30 or so Barbie dolls, some she inherited from her mother. But she only had one Ken doll. And one day I'm watching her play, and I notice she takes the one and only Ken doll and one of the 30 Barbie dolls, and she puts them in a Barbie doll bed together. And I say to myself as a father, never too early to start with moral training. So I said, honey, I see Ken and Barbie are in bed together, and I'm just wondering, are they married? And my kindergartner looks up at me and she says, oh, no, Dad, they're just tired. I didn't give up. I plowed ahead. And I said, honey, different families have different rules, but in our family, men and women are not in bed with one another unless they are married. And because I established that rule, very quickly the one Ken doll was married to all 30 Barbie dolls. Great. Trying to teach my daughter morality, I ended up teaching her polygamy, right? Is that what Bill Friedrich is worried about? Should I right away have called 911? Oh, my daughter has a Ken and Barbie in a Barbie doll bed together? No. This is why therapists use play therapy. The child's play often reflects their experiences. She has seen mom and dad in bed together. She wakes us up because she had a bad dream, or wakes us up because it's Christmas morning and wants to open the packages under the tree. What Friedrich is worried about would be if the 5-year-old took the Ken and Barbie doll, manipulated them into sexual positions, combined it with sexual sounds, was demonstrating a knowledge of sexual activity, which at such a young age would be rare. So let's practice. I took this hypothetical from the National Center for the Sexual Behavior of Youth. Is this normal or abnormal? Mr. and Mrs. Cornelison's 4 sons range in age from 5 to 10. All the boys loved sports. Every evening and weekend was filled with practices, games, other activities. One Saturday morning, Mrs. Cornelison tells her sons to get in their uniforms for their games. As the children dress, it's unusually quiet in the bedroom. So Mrs. Cornelison went to see what was happening. She found 2 of her sons, ages 7 and 9, undressed and touching each other's private parts. She was shocked. She told her husband what she saw. Mr. Cornelison had the boys get dressed, and he talked to each of them separately. The boys seemed embarrassed, and they just said they were just getting dressed, and they're kind of curious, wondering what it'd be like to touch each other's genitals. Normal or abnormal? Probably, if this is all we have, it's normal. They're just curious, and they're wondering what you do with these sorts of things. And as long as it's an isolated incident, and now mom and dad give the kids some instructions, hey, don't while you're touching each other's genitals. If you got questions about penises and how our bodies work or sexual matters, anything like that, you can talk to me or mom, and we're happy to dialogue with you. And with that instruction, it probably won't happen again. If it does, then it might fit into a different scenario. How about this? Ms. Blackwood is worried about her grandchildren. Summer, age 7, Darren, age 5. Their dad sexually abused them a year ago. Summer and Darren were sent to live with Ms. Blackwood after her daughter, the children's mother, left to be with her husband. Since being in her home, her grandchildren have no boundaries. No one is a stranger. They try to hug and kiss everybody. Summer especially likes to talk with men, even at the grocery store. Recently, Ms. Blackwood found Summer with her mouth on Darren's privates while they were taking a bath together. Ms. Blackwood didn't know what to do. She just froze watching them. After the initial state of shock, she told the children that they had better stop that. Summer wasn't upset about her behavior or about how it might impact Darren. Normal or abnormal? Well, this is more concerning, and it's a much more explicit sexual act. It involves some form of fellatio, it looks like. And of course, we already know the history of sexual abuse, and now it might warrant a professional intervention in working with these children, and some simple rules such as not bathing together in the future. Ann Ratnick, who used to be with the National District Attorneys Association, she is a great lawyer. She currently serves on the board of directors of our Zero Abuse Project. She wrote an article for the NDAA, and she said for kids below the age of 12 with these concerning behaviors, the younger the child, the more likely they're just mimicking behaviors they've seen or experienced. So an initial step for the MDT is to screen for the possibility of child abuse. And if there is no abuse, but there are concerning behaviors that the family won't work with us on voluntarily, then perhaps consider filing a civil child protection petition. So that's for pre-adolescents. What's normal or abnormal for adolescent or teens? Dr. Anna Salter, a famous sex offender treatment provider, says for adolescents and teens, this is all normal. They will talk about sex with their friends. They will make dirty jokes as long as it's within the cultural norm of their community. It's not something you need to call the police about. They will absolutely flirt and court or engage in sexual innuendo. So it'd be perfectly normal for a 17-year-old boy to say to a 17-year-old girl, you must be a parking ticket because you got fine written all over you. I Googled teenage pickup lines last night. So if you hear something like that, they may need some advice, some aid in how do you ask a girl out on a date, but you probably don't need to call the police. That's all pretty darn normal. They're interested in erotica, and if they got a phone, they probably have looked at it. They are now certainly masturbating alone or with others, and they hug and they kiss and they hold hands when they're dating. They engage in foreplay and even sexual intercourse. And as long as it's between two consenting adolescents or teens, we don't need to get the authorities involved. Now, I'm not talking about morality. We may have disagreements of what is or is not immoral for this population. That's a different issue, and they certainly need guidance about these sexual decisions. I'm simply saying that, according to Anna Salter, this is all normal, and we don't need to get the authorities involved. What then is abnormal for adolescents and teenagers? Well, she divides it into three categories of deviance, the least egregious to the most egregious. Deviant level 1, these are kids who have a high preoccupation and anxiety about sexual matters. They're always accessing pornography. So the kid who is falling asleep in high school because they've been awake for 3 or 4 nights constantly watching pornography on their phones, that becomes abnormal. Not the two teenagers who are boyfriend, girlfriend, and they have sex, but the teenager who's indiscriminately having sex with a wide variety of people. They're hooking up with 2, 3 strangers every single week. That's unusual and often indicative of trauma. sexually aggressive remarks, obscenities, graffiti. So I had a case where a teenager would make jokes about rape to other girls in the high school. He'd walk past a girl and say things like, "Oh, I wish you were a bowling ball. I'd roll you down the hall." So this obscene image of digital and anal penetration flowing from his lips. Not surprising, that boy eventually was charged as a delinquent for, in fact, sexually assaulting a girl. Trying to embarrass others with sexual remarks, posting online that you saw where a particular couple was making out, wherever kids make out in your community, purposely trying to embarrass others, pulling their skirts up, pants down, again, to humiliate somebody, violating the space of other children. You know you're making them uncomfortable, but you still are constantly getting within an inch or two of their face. How should MDTs respond when we see this sort of deviance? Dr. Salter says, well, it's a red flag for sexually aggressive impulses. So some intervention might be helpful, even if it's only voluntary services, educators, counselors saying, hey, you're making others uncomfortable. This is immoral. This is concerning. It's inappropriate. Let's talk about what is driving your behavior and what can we do about it. Her mid-category of deviance, deviant level 2, compulsive masturbation. So not kids masturbating 2 or 3 times a week, which would be normal under the research, but kids who are masturbating several times a day. They're excusing themselves from school and going into the bathroom and relieving themselves, lowering their anxiety by masturbating in a semi-public place. That, at some level, becomes abnormal. A child who engages in sexual act that is of a degrading or humiliating nature. I had a case when I was a prosecutor of a boy who sexually abused about a dozen children, and so he ends up in inpatient treatment, and eventually he goes to a professional foster home. And as it turns out, in treatment, we learned that this boy was also sexually abused by 17 different adults. His mom, his dad, his grandmas, his grandpas, his aunts, his uncles, and he had gone through a number of trials against these offenders. Well, one day I get a call in the middle of the night from our social worker who says, hey, this boy is in the hospital, and I got to make sure we have the legal authority to consent to surgery. And I said, surgery? What's going on? And the social worker said, well, we're still trying to sort it out, but apparently he broke in to the garage of his foster father, stole a fish line, and tied it around his nipples so tight it's going to take surgery to remove it. Well, after this surgery, the boy is back into treatment, and the treatment provider says, what was going on that night? And the boy said, I wanted to masturbate, but I couldn't get an erection. And I can't get an erection unless I cause myself extraordinary pain. And so he would describe some of the things he would do to his body. And so that's what I was trying to do that night. Now, we already know the trauma the boy endured and how concerning his own sexual behaviors were, but if we simply knew that he can't get an erection, he can't pleasure himself without causing extraordinary pain and mutilating his own body, that would be a red flag that something is awry and that the child has likely endured trauma. Trying to expose the genitals of others to humiliate to them, chronic preoccupation, not with pornography, but sexually aggressive pornography. So films depicting rape or bondage or other cruel, senseless acts. Sexually explicit conversations with younger children. So not making a dirty joke with your peer, but a 16-year-old talking about sexually explicit matters with, say, a 5-year-old. And then any sort of sexually explicit threat or obscene phone calls, all of that would be concerning. And she said, yeah, we got to do something here. There's high preoccupation of deviant sexual interests, and so something needs to be done, even if it's only voluntary services. And then her top category of deviance, these are acts which, if committed by an adult, would be a crime. So genital touching without permission, that is a sexual assault. Sexual contact with a significant age difference, the 17-year-old touching the 3-year-old sibling. Forced sexual contact or penetration, so violent sexual assault. Sexual contact with animals, bestiality, is a crime. Causing genital injuries to others, that case I mentioned where 3 teenagers break into the adult woman's house, it's not a classic sexual assault. They tie her up naked and they mutilate her body with cans and the like, but that is also a sexual assault. And that sort of cruelty is a deeply troubling behavior. And in these situations, Salter says, there is no option here. At a minimum, these cases require delinquency action, if not a reference to adult court. So let's practice. This is a case I took from a clinician's textbook. This woman is in therapy. She's in her 40s. For much of her childhood, her older brother sexually abused her. And she says to her therapist, the first time he did something that was troubling, I was only 6 and he was 12, so twice her age. He persuades me to lie down on a bathroom floor. There were some neighbor boys in the house. He promised not to let them in. He got me on the floor with my pants down, and then he opened the door, and he had a big laugh about it. Now, if you could go back in time and you learned about this scenario, there's multiple red flags here. Applying Salter's breakdown, he is twice her age, so this is not 2 6-year-olds playing, show me yours, I'll show you mine. He's double her age. He's promising her that he won't humiliate her, and yet that is in his mind at all times. There's a lot of thought and planning into what he's doing here, and he has no remorse when he humiliates her by exposing her genitals to his peers. There's a lot of red flags here. And if you could go back in time and nip it in the bud at this juncture, maybe we could have prevented him from becoming a juvenile sex offender. 16-year-old youth in a position of leadership at a youth serving organization isolates a 12-year-old youth and invites him or her to play truth or dare. The younger child chooses dare, and the 16-year-old dares the younger child to touch the older child's genitals. Normal or abnormal? Applying Salter's research, there's significant age difference. If this were committed by an adult, it would be a crime, and probably in all 50 states this warrants a delinquency petition. We got an older youth. They're in a position of authority. There's a 4-year age difference. The older youth is isolating the younger child. And most youth leaders in the Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, and the like are taught through personal safety and other education not to do this sort of thing. So there's probably no doubt that they know the wrongfulness of their conduct. So all these factors rise to the level where probably we're filing a delinquency action. This was a case I consulted on in a swimming program. 4 teenagers, all boys, all 16, they're at a hotel for a swim meet. 3 of the boys gang up on a boy who is often picked on, while 2 of the boys hold the victim to the ground. The 3rd boy attempts to teabag the victim by forcing his testicles into the victim's mouth. The victim's yelling causes a youth serving organization chaperone to walk in and discover this offense. Normal or abnormal? Well, this is a sexual assault. And it warrants some governmental action. But keep in mind the possibility of peer pressure. And as this case was investigated, it looked like the younger, or the 3 of the boys that were the boys that were holding the victim down, they had no idea it was going to gravitate toward a sexual assault. They just thought they were going to bully this kid as they had in the past. And the one boy seemed to be the primary aggressor. So they all probably need to be subjects of a delinquency action, but there may be differences in terms of the egregiousness of their conduct and their amenability toward treatment. This was a case I handled almost 30 years ago. 14-year-old boy has been warned at a youth camp about sexually aggressive remarks directed toward a girl his age. About 5 minutes after he's been warned, he's been told, you do this again, we're kicking you out of the camp. 5 minutes later, he walks past that girl, he takes a pencil from his pocket and forcibly jabs it into her breast, causing pain. Normal or abnormal? Well, this is a sexual assault. It is sexual contact involving force, and the fact that he had concerning language before that, the fact that he was just warned not to do it again or there'd be consequences, and 5 minutes later, he's elevating his conduct. There's multiple red flags. We succeeded in a delinquency petition. The boy was kicked out of treatment because he wasn't cooperating. And when the boy was a young man, about 19 or so, he was rearrested for sexually assaulting a 12-year-old girl. I don't think his parents and his high-priced attorney, who vigorously objected to any sort of treatment, were doing him any favor whatsoever. And you got to wonder why those folks were so resistive to him getting whatever treatment he needed for his misconduct as a juvenile. Some of you are detectives. How do you interview children with sexual behavior problems? Well, these kids have constitutional rights, Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, and we know from case law across the country the courts are going to scrutinize their waiver at a higher level than they would for adults. Factors courts look at is how old is the child? Have they been involved with law enforcement in the past? What is their functioning at the time of the conversation? Do they have an attorney present? Do they have their parents present? How long are you speaking to the child? And did you impose any conditions? Apply that to our scenario with John. Well, John had ADHD, he had anxiety, he had medications. So you would have to make sure in a scenario like that, what are the medications? When did he take them last? When did they kick in? Is he at a mental level where he can converse about this particular case? Things like that we're going to have to take into account. If you think there might be a delinquency action or a reference to adult court, and you have to explain their constitutional rights, you're going to have to do it in a way that they can understand. So some detectives will give a right, and they'll ask the child, do you understand it? Can you explain it back to me? And if they can't, they'll spend some more time to make sure the child can understand each and every one of their rights. That's why, detectives, it's so helpful for you to go through forensic interview training, even if you don't do forensic interviews, because you do talk to other children in the context of your work. So you'll have these slides and you'll have these examples as they appear on the screen. The forensic interviewers with us today, how do you handle the situation where you've got a child who is both a victim of abuse and a potential offender? What do you do there? Well, if possible, we should separate those interviews. Somebody who's the interviewer should be talking to the child about their own victimization, and somebody from law enforcement should be speaking to them about their possible perpetration. There are clearly different purposes in those conversations, and the child, for the potential delinquency matter, has constitutional rights that need to be respected by everybody. Having said that, a bright line is not always possible. So I would say this. If you're doing a forensic interview with a victim, and out of the blue, they start to talk about that they are also a perpetrator, I think you need to stop them and say, that's very important, but I'm not the person to speak to about that. I'll make sure somebody else converses with you about that. I just want to know what others did to you today, because that child does have constitutional rights, and if you plow ahead, there could be legal consequences. I think it's different, though, if you're a detective and you're speaking to a child about their sexual misconduct. They violated a younger brother or sister, and then they also start to share with you that they were sexually abused by, say, their dad or their mom. I think you can now plow ahead and get that information, because if you stop and we wait a week or two before we can get the child in for a forensic interview, pressures may be placed on that child. We may never get that information again. And so then I think it's okay to plow ahead. I would make those distinctions. The 7-year-old performing cunnilingus on the 5-year-old, then probably there's not going to be a delinquency action at all. Those kids do have a constitutional right to a fair trial if there's a civil child protection action, but you're not worried about these quasi-criminal justice issues. So in those scenarios, maybe if the team is in agreement, we don't really have to worry as we interview both that 5 and 7-year-old. We just need to know what's going on and what we can do to help the families. I mentioned Ann Bratnick. This is the article she wrote for the NDA a few years ago. She said, well, when these cases arise, prosecutors have lots of options. They could file a civil child protection action, a delinquency action. They might reference a child to adult court. And a lot of these decisions will depend on, is the alleged offender amenable to treatment? Again, SOMAPI can help us out. They have an entire chapter on what we know from research and how can we assess to the best of our ability is a child at high risk to re-offend. Now, all recidivism research has an obvious weakness. We're typically measuring recidivism by, did the child get caught again? And if you accept that some children, as well as adults, will re-offend and not get caught, then these recidivism rates are a base level. The actual recidivism rate will always be higher than what shows up in these studies. And if we're working with a juvenile offender, we just don't know very much about their recidivism rate. And yet, as we peruse through SAMAPI, we know there's a ton of research on recidivism. You see these meta-analyses pop up on your screen. Bottom line, according to the SAMAPI report, is juveniles have a recidivism rate of somewhere between 7 and 13%, which is much lower than we see from adult offenders. And that's really encouraging, especially when you recall that most adult offenders, when we catch them, they're going to prison for a long time, and then when they get out, they are being rigorously monitored under registration requirements. So it's just harder for them to reoffend than it is for children. And so the fact that children who are much less rigorously monitored and are not typically going to inpatient, when those kids have a much lower recidivism rate, that is extremely encouraging for our multidisciplinary teams and gives us a great deal of hope. What do we know about the treatment of juveniles with sexual behavior problems? Well, we know if it's good treatment, we are going to significantly lower the recidivism rate. So here's 20 years of research where they measured recidivism in 3 different ways. Did this adjudicated delinquent child with a sexual offense, did they have another sexual charge at a 10 or 20-year interval? Did they have another violent act, but not of a sexual nature? Or did they have any charge at all, even as simple as shoplifting? And however they measured it, at both the 10 and 20-year intervals, those children who went through some sort of treatment had a much lower recidivism rate than those who didn't go through treatment at all. That is extremely encouraging, is it not? Well, it begs the question, what sort of treatment works? Well, SAMAPI says there are several options. Relapse prevention is one evidence-based model, premised on the idea if we can identify 6, 7 things a child does before they reoffend, we can nip it in the bud. So I worked on a case where a juvenile had a certain pattern. They would have an unhealthy fantasy about sexually touching a younger child. Then they would engage in voyeurism, watching the person shower or undress or go to the bathroom. Then they would steal underwear. They would wear the underwear. They would masturbate in the underwear. They would then watch pornography, and then after watching pornography, they would sexually assault a victim. Well, you've identified a certain pattern here. So could we, in treatment, help the child to understand their own pattern to help them nip it in the bud at an early stage? And could we educate those around the child about these sort of things? So if they catch a child engaging in, say, voyeurism, we know to rein that in very, very quickly. That's one possibility. Cognitive behavioral therapy, premised on the idea that how we think about something determines our feelings, and those feelings determine our actions. So if we have an unhealthy sexual fantasy, we get sexually aroused as a result, and then we do something that is misconduct. Well, if we can change our thinking pattern, then we'll change our feelings, and our feelings will change our conduct. That is also a potential effective approach. Multisystemic therapy is premised on the idea that if we can keep the child in their natural environment, their own home, their own school, their own church, and pour resources into that family, moms and dads and others intersecting with that child's life, that may be the most effective, although there are more MST studies on non-sex offenders than sex offenders. But the research that has been done is very encouraging, and that too is summarized in the SAMAPI report. So it does seem to be, if we can keep the child in their environment, pour services into that environment, that may be the most effective in the long term. These are indicators. You've got a child at high risk to reoffend. Do they have deviant interests? So they're fantasizing about, say, violent rape. They continue to act out in sexually inappropriate ways, even though there are prior delinquency actions, prior treatment programs. They still continue down a bad path. That's an indicator that this is going to be a long-term problem. They've got multiple victims. They're targeting strangers, people they barely know. They're socially isolated. They don't have any peers, and they're just unwilling to form any sort of peer relationship. And just unwilling to participate in treatment. So let's go back to our hypothetical with John. He seems to be at lower risk to reoffend. He's already participating in treatment. Even in the sex offender treatment, he was in the final stages. He does have strong family. He is struggling with making friends, but he wants to make friends, and he does have a pro-social, non-criminal attitude. So he is a lower risk to reoffend, not a guarantee, but a lower risk. These factors are irrelevant. Did John penetrate or have contact with his victims? The fact that a juvenile may initially deny or minimize their conduct, that doesn't matter as long as the denial doesn't get to a point where they won't participate in treatment. These factors are associated with lower recidivism. Do you have a positive family unit? Do you have some good social groups? Do you have a supportive adult around you? Are you committed to school? A pro-social, non-criminal attitude, a sense of spirituality that can help rein you in part perhaps because if God is around you all the time, God knows what you're doing, even when it is misconduct. So things like that could be helpful and could also help a child cope with their own sense of guilt or shame. Again, applying that to John, he seems to be in a pretty good category. Not a guarantee he won't reoffend, but he seems to have a lower risk. So when would you put John and his sister together again? When would we reunite them? Dr. Barbara Bonner, who is now retired but used to be part of the University of Oklahoma's National Center for the Sexual Behavior of Youth, she says, well, you know, has John made meaningful progress in treatment? Not completed treatment. He made treatment for the rest of his life, given his high trauma history. But has he made meaningful progress in treatment? Does he have parents who are willing to rein him in and provide close supervision and enforce common sense rules like he won't babysit or have supervisory authority over younger kids. He won't be bathing or dressing around children. He's going to be fully dressed in public areas of the home. We're going to monitor him when he's online, so he won't be accessing pornography or other sexual imageries. He's not going to share a room with younger kids, and he won't go into the rooms of other children. No hugs or kisses with his victim, because that could conjure up memories of the sexual touching. And if we have a good safety plan like this, he may be a good candidate to be reunited. But we would also want to make sure that the treatment provider for the victim is on board, because even if John is at low risk to reoffend, if the victim can't handle it, her needs should always take precedent over the needs of the offender, and that's something the professionals are going to have to work with John on. We celebrate your success. We celebrate that professionals think you are at low risk to reoffend, but one of the tough lessons of life is when you hurt somebody, their needs will always come forward. This is another Department of Justice document you can find that gave a summary of registration requirements. Some states will have juveniles register as offenders. Some will leave it up to a judge. Some have no registration. Some have a more complex model. And reasonable minds may differ, but there are some studies saying if you put a kid like John on a public registry, he's at higher risk to reoffend, because now he's going to gravitate toward the worst elements at school. He's not going to be able to develop strong friendships. He's not going to be able to have good peers and the like. And so it may make it harder for him to adjust and to grow into a healthy person. And if that's our concern, make sure John doesn't reoffend, we need to take that research into account. On the other hand, I am not in the category of those who say never put a child on a registry. If you get that really horrible scenario of 3 teenagers breaking into an adult woman's house, tying her up, torturing her during the evening, I probably we're not going to be able to fix that in the juvenile system, and those kids may be at high risk to reoffend for a very long time. And so I do like those states who say, let's have a hearing, let's talk about it with the judge, let's figure it out on a case-by-case basis as opposed to a one-size-fits-all. Life is complicated, and we need to take cases as we find them. Okay, we have about 8 minutes, I think, William, for questions. So hopefully what we talked about today was helpful.
Okay, thank you, Victor. And we do have the questions queued up for you here in the audience questions. So whenever you're ready, you can take a look at them and see which ones you'd like to address.
Somebody says, so if in Friedrich, somebody takes their 3-year-old off getting a diaper change. Well, let me read it, make sure I understand. If there's a 3-year-old at a daycare who takes off his pants and goes and lays on another 3-year-old who's getting a diaper change and also naked, that would be normal sexualized behavior. There's quite a bit going on there. So I guess I would need to know a whole lot more and maybe consult with, say, somebody at the National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network, one of those hospitals, or somebody else fluent in the research. I'm pretty fluent in the research, so feel free to contact me privately and we can dialogue more. I think I need some more facts there to sort it out. So I'm not ready to say that's normal or abnormal. Somebody in one of the pre-questions asked me when, if ever, would you reference a child to adult court. You're going to have to look at your state law. Some states say, well, there's a presumption to be referenced to adult court if you're above a certain age and you commit an act that would warrant an immediate prison sentence if you were an adult. And in my state of Minnesota, under those circumstances, they actually shift the burden to the juvenile and his or her counsel to show that they could still be treated in juvenile court. So I guess generally what I see across the country, it has to be older youth, and it has to be a very violent crime, often with a weapon, and it has to be pretty clear that this is going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to address before the juvenile ages out of the system. Another option in some states is extended juvenile court jurisdiction, where a child gets a potential prison sentence, but they don't go to prison. They stay in the system longer to see if we can address their needs. So that might be an option. So work with your prosecutors to sort through what your state law says to figure out those characteristics. Another pre-question, somebody said, could I limit a juvenile who's been adjudicated delinquent to, say, social media and their cell phones and the like? Yeah, the judge could order that if that's been things that have triggered misconduct in the past. You don't have a constitutional right to keep engaging in that behavior if it has led you to engage in delinquent action. So whatever needs to be done in the case plan, the judge almost certainly would have the power to do that. Somebody said, what are the biggest red flags they can point to when it comes to children's sexual abuse? Well, the biggest red flags would be violence and abusing kids older than you, and having no remorse, no anxiety, no depression, no worries about it. Kids fit into that population are going to be much more concerning. For the younger kids, say that 7-year-old who performed a very explicit sexual act, and it sure didn't look like two kids playing around, and one child was crying, and it looked like there was an element of force, then those are red flags for, gosh, I wonder what is driving that behavior, and could it be that one of the children, if not both, has endured trauma. So the more egregious the conduct is, the greater the worries, and if it's a younger kid, we're not thinking of delinquency actions, certainly not criminal actions, but we might be thinking of screening for abuse and the possibility of a civil action if the parents won't intervene. That a 5-year-old who was exposed to pornography that was showing up in his behaviors, it's pretty clear the dad thought it was all normal. We needed to take an action there. William, we have just about 3 minutes left. Did you have some closing thoughts?
Yeah, and it looks like that will be our very last question that we have there, since you're correctly right at about the end of the presentation in 3 minutes. So I would like to thank you, Victor, for yet another great presentation. I'm sure our audience definitely has gotten a lot of great information out of it. And to our audience, thank you for submitting your questions. Before we end, I would like to just wrap up with a few last-minute items for you all, and a few last-minute notes and announcements. So please note, if you'd like to get in contact or learn a little bit more about OJJDP's INTAC, you may do so by reaching out to us through the links that are present on this slide. You can also reach out to us on Facebook. We're located at OJJDP TTA. You can also sign up for our listservs, where you can learn about more upcoming trainings that we have in the future. If you'd like to reach out to OJJDP, you may do so via the OJJDP Help Desk. either by phone or by emailing at this address here located on this slide. You can also click on the link here for the URL to access the website for OJJDP, and you can also click on the sign up link here, which will sign you up for OJJDP's listserv, where you can get more information about upcoming events with the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Do you have a training or technical assistance need? Well, if so, you may reach out and request for assistance via the TTA 360 platform. You can access the TTA 360 platform using the link that is located on this slide. Please note that we have our webinars available for review on our NTAC YouTube channel that can be accessed through the link here. For any supporting materials or anything related to the webinar, you can reach out to the OJJDP TTA Help Desk and receive those items there. Please take a moment to review the attribution and disclaimer file here, statement here on this slide. And join us for upcoming webinars that we have coming later on this month. We have a webinar with our colleagues with the National Gang Center and with the National District Attorneys Association. Both of these links are live for you to both register and to learn more about each of these webinars. We have another webinar with our colleagues here at Zero Abuse coming up at the end of this month. So please click on the Register Now link there in order to register for each of these webinars. We also have a webinar with our colleagues with the Western Regional Children's Advocacy Center as well coming up at the end of the month. So thank you all very much. And also please be sure, if you'd like to get more information about Zero Abuse, especially around trainings, please be sure to email training@zeroabuseproject.org as well. And thank you, Victoria, for providing that information for our audience. And last, but certainly not least, I would like to take a few minutes for folks to complete a quick poll here. Basically, we want to know, how do you plan on using the information that you learned from this webinar? This is multi